This video represents the first unofficial collaboration between genetically modified Skeptic and HEB's generic daytime cold and flu medicine. Okay, if my voice in this video annoys you, don't say that I didn't take the proper preventative measures. Oh, also a little announcement before we start. I will be at the American Atheists National Convention in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's April 17th through the 20th. Get your tickets now to come hang out with me, Taylor, and some other YouTubers you probably also watch. The link will be in the description. Back when I was a young adult raised in the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, my whole ideology and identity revolved around belief in religious claims related to metaphysics and science. This meant that my judgment of a person's character came down to whether or not they affirmed certain religious ideas. One time in the Dino Dig children's exhibit at the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History, the museum that I grew up going to a lot, a little preteen Drew struck up a conversation with a museum employee asking a bunch of creationist gotcha questions about evolution and carbon dating and all that. To my surprise, she started smiling and nodding as my questions got more pointed and aggressive and started answering me with things like, "Oh, good question. I wonder about that too." My parents walked up after a minute or two to see what I was going on and on about with this random stranger again, and it came out that we were Christians and didn't believe in evolution. This museum employee lit up and said she was too, and that she had to keep her opinions to herself at the museum, so it was encouraging, actually, to hear a kid like me asking such good questions. Before she said that, I felt little more than contempt for her. She was a liar and purveyor of pseudoscience above all. After learning her position, the contempt mostly evaporated, although a little bit remained because she was obviously willing to compromise with liars and purveyors of pseudoscience for a paycheck. Later on, as a teenager at Woodward Skate Camp, I had trouble getting along with other campers. As soon as one of them said a swear word or made a dirty joke, I reasoned that they had clearly not received salvation. They didn't have the Holy Spirit in their hearts, and so were fundamentally incapable of the level of morality that I and my Christian community possessed. It wasn't their individual acts of crudeness that bothered me, but rather their fundamental character flaws that I assumed they had as non-Christians. As you might imagine, this made approaching them difficult and nearly killed our ability to relate to each other. But this is just how it was for me. If you were not aligned with my religious beliefs, I saw you as alien, tainted, unrelatable, fundamentally other. But as you guys know, at 21 years old, I couldn't believe it all anymore. It wasn't just Christianity, it was belief in the supernatural that didn't seem justifiable to me. After a lot of thought, I left Christianity and eventually began to think of myself as an agnostic or atheist. I was in the closet, so to speak, for about a year with this. The only person I told was my wife, and I felt very lucky that she didn't leave me, given that she was also super Christian. The social consequences for leaving the faith were massive in my community. Literally everyone I knew was Christian. So I had to play along or else risk every relationship in my life. Okay, I did have one Buddhist friend from Sri Lanka at my school, and he was often a pet project and looked down upon, so okay, there was that one. I had to tell my parents I was still going to church. I had to say prayers at dinner in front of friends and family. I had to teach kids about the Bible at the Christian homeless shelter I worked for or else get fired, all while not believing any of it. Eventually, my parents started sensing something was off, and I was forced to have a conversation with them about it. Honestly, after a whole year, I was sick of pretending, and the main thing that worried me about being open as an atheist was not the social fallout. I was concerned that my parents might believe that I was going to hell, and I didn't want to put them through that. Hell, for them, was eternal fire, burning forever and ever and ever and ever, as the pastor often screamed from the stage. No parent should ever have to even picture their kid going through that. I can't imagine how painful that could be. But we met up. I sat down with them and I just told them the truth. In my last semester of college, I started to really question my beliefs and I left Christianity about a year ago. I don't believe in God and I consider myself an agnostic atheist. They were stunned, obviously, and said they were glad I at least told them. The first thing I said after that initial moment of shock was, "Do you think I'm going to hell?" They said no, and explained that since I had clearly received salvation when I was a kid, my soul was fortunately safe and I'd still go to heaven. I was so relieved. Then they asked me something. The first thing they wanted to know after finding out I didn't believe their God was real, that I'd been faking it for a year, that I thought their Lord and Savior was just a nice dude who had a bunch of myths circulating around his life. They asked me, "Does this mean you're a communist?" What? Why is that relevant? Why are we talking about politics now? What is happening? Okay, I wasn't actually that surprised. No, I told them, this isn't about politics at all. Just because I'm an atheist doesn't mean I'm a communist too. They were so relieved. Like, oh, thank goodness. Oh, the situation, it's workable then. I get it, okay. Wow, that was almost really bad. See, there's something I've often left out when describing my upbringing. My parents believe that since Democrats somewhat more often advocated for social programs, Democrats were socialists, and socialists were communists, and communism was satanic, and Satan wanted to spread godless ideology across the world so he could take the world back from God and damn every human soul to hell. And that Rush Limbaugh had this all figured out. Even as a kid, I always disliked the grating personalities of right-wing pundits like Rush Limbaugh, so I never absorbed this whole religious conspiracy theory to the level that my parents did. This is why I thought that my atheism was the ultimate barrier between me and my religious family and community, while my parents were also very concerned about my politics. The fear of communism and the association between atheism and communism in the psyche of the religious right is a huge part of anti-atheist attitudes in the United States. Understanding how this developed is key to understanding why the religious right hates some atheists while praising others, like Elon Musk.
I'm less convinced that there's, say, some super consciousness watching over our every movement and kind of evaluating it against some criteria, and deciding whether we're going to go to one place or another when we die.
Can science and religion coexist?
Probably not.
Do you pray?
I don't. I didn't even pray when I almost died of malaria.
Yeah, it's much deeper than Musk pays lip service to them. He calls himself a cultural Christian, and he says he likes some teachings of Jesus. No, there are tons of actual Christians that the religious right hates. There are also other non-believers that don't pay the same lip service to Christianity who the religious right likes. So we've got to ask, what's the real story here? The answer, I think, explains why right-wing religious Americans admire and praise Elon, why they like some other atheist tech bros now, and why the right seems so united here in the US. When they've been benefiting from them for a while, Americans, even Republicans, generally like welfare programs like Social Security. This is probably why folks across the political spectrum are flooding town halls to speak against DOGE cutting Social Security. Over 70 sources have reported on this story, and while left and center-leaning sources focus on seniors voicing their fears of their incomes being cut off, right-leaning sources, as of the time of this video, are hardly covering the story at all. That fact alone is a valuable insight into this story. I was able to gain that insight at a literal glance because I found this story on Ground News, an independent app and website I've not only partnered with and promoted for years, but actually use every day. For real, I genuinely recommend it to my friends in real life. Their platform organizes every published perspective on an issue in one place with data on each outlet's political bias, credibility, and financial incentives. I use their Vantage plan, and you can get 40% off that plan by going to ground.news/skeptic. While right-leaning sources haven't covered the story much, Ground News has a great feature called their Blind Spot feed, which is dedicated to surfacing important stories that are being completely ignored by one side of the political spectrum or another. So, right-leaning Ground News users stand a way better chance of seeing this story than they would without Ground News. Having this feature right there on your phone or in your inbox provides a ton of value, especially right now as the media landscape gets more chaotic nearly every day. Now, I can't promise you better news, but I can promise you a better way to read it if you go to ground.news/skeptic or scan the QR code on your screen. There you can get the same Vantage plan I use every day for just $5 a month. Taking advantage of these tools is a great step toward reading the news skeptically and staying properly informed. It's the 1930s, and American economic opportunity is starting to increase again. If you're a normal working person, that is. Since the Great Depression began in 29 and the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 33, regular Americans have welcomed the New Deal, federal policies to prevent corporate monopolies, create economic stability, and protect the rights of workers. The New Deal helped strengthen labor unions, banned child labor, set a minimum wage, and created Social Security, among other things, and the insanely popular FDR spoke about this in biblical terms.
Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths.
This was the realization of the Christian movement toward the social gospel, the idea that Christians should strive to aid their fellow man's earthly well-being, not just save their soul. Big business types were not happy about all this. The New Deal kept super-rich oil tycoons and steel magnates from basically enslaving children and poor people in their factories, and it forced them to pay higher taxes than poor people. Come on, that's not fair. I need this money to buy another fleet of Duesenbergs and go on safaris and kill endangered animals and destroy villages in colonial Africa to build another mine. So, business leaders at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, and others start pumping money into propaganda to convince the public that only free enterprise and big business can save them from the Depression. This doesn't work. People knew it was big business that screwed them over and caused the Depression in the first place. So what's a rich guy to do? Well, they develop a strategy.
And so they say, okay, well, we need to rethink our campaign. How are we going to convince people business is the way? Well, they look at the polls. Who's the most trusted person in America? A minister is. And they say this quite explicitly. We need to get ministers to make the case. So let's make a case that free enterprise goes hand in hand with political freedom and religious freedom, and you can't have any of those without all three together.
And who's the central character in that?
A minister named Reverend James W. Fifield.
Yeah, they enlist this rich pastor from Los Angeles to help spread a message that should sound familiar today.
And he preaches a message that they like to hear, which is that the New Deal is evil. It is a form, he says, of pagan statism, and instead what we need is a return to, again, this kind of unfettered free enterprise. He links Christianity and capitalism. He sees that they're deeply intertwined. In his view, both are systems that stress individualism above all else. So as he tells it, Christianity is a system in which if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. Capitalism is the same way, he says. If you're good, you make a profit. If you're bad, you go to the poorhouse. And any system that interferes with that divinely prescribed order of things, he says, is a form of pagan statism and is itself evil.
With this, the Christian capitalist propaganda group called Spiritual Mobilization forms. Their strategy? Convince Christian ministers that the New Deal is a threat to Christianity, to their very own livelihoods, and have them preach sermons written, for the most part, by leaders of spiritual mobilization. Their catchphrase? Freedom under God. This effort gets crazy backing from corporate America. The president of Sun Oil, Howard Pugh Jr., signed on as a patron and used his connections to help secure donations from 158 other corporations. General Motors, Chrysler, Republic Steel, National Steel, International Harvester, Firestone Tire and Rubber, Sun Oil, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Colgate-Palmolive began contributing the maximum legally allowable annual donation. By 1947, Spiritual Mobilization, thanks to all of this funding, recruited over 10,000 ministers across the country. They launched a radio broadcast called The Freedom Story and a magazine called Faith and Freedom. One issue of their magazine, dedicated to bashing liberal Christian ministers, contained these statements. Their gospel is pure socialism. They wish to employ the compulsion of the state to force others to act as the social gospels think they should act. How do you guys like my mid-century radio guy voice? Communism seeks to destroy the capitalist minority, no matter what killing, stealing, lying, and covetousness are required. The social gospel calls for the destruction of this minority by the more peaceful means of the popular vote. To put it bluntly, by socialized covetousness, stealing, and the bearing of false witness. This propaganda worked. September 23rd, 1949. President Truman announces that the Soviet Union has the atomic bomb. September 25th, 1949. A young Billy Graham preaches to a crowd of 5,000 at an outdoor revival in Los Angeles. I don't do a good Billy Graham, so you're just gonna have to settle with this. Communism has decided against God, against Christ, against the Bible, and against all religion. Communism is not only an economic interpretation of life, communism is a religion that is inspired, directed, and motivated by the devil himself, who has declared war against Almighty God. Hey, like I've said many times, I'm the first in several generations of men in my family not to be a preacher, so, I've inherited some skill, I think. This revival was supposed to last 3 weeks, but instead went for 8, with over 350,000 people in attendance. As his career boomed, Graham consulted personally with captains of industry, who no doubt supported him in return. He spread the notion that Christianity and capitalism go hand in hand, and he spoke feverishly against organized labor.
He tells a Greensboro, North Carolina crusade in 1952 that the Garden of Eden is a paradise where there will be no union dues, no labor leaders, no snakes, and no disease. He says, the kind of revival I'm calling for, he tells a Boston crowd, is a revival that'll have the worker put in an honest 8 hours work. He says, no good Christian would ever strike against his employer. And those employers, he says, are the really true Christians.
One of my favorite Billy Graham fun facts is that on Labor Day 1952, Billy Graham even preached that certain labor leaders in the United States in the 50s wanted to outlaw religion. At this point, the American government was in a panic, trying to hunt down communists in the country. If you weren't religious, you were suspicious. If you wanted more social programs, you were suspicious.
If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist.
A good God and libertarian capitalism went hand in hand. So, in the American mind, so did atheism and the evils of communism. Yeah, this is starting to sound exactly like the political ideology I grew up with. All of this preaching, backed all the way by the biggest corporations in the country, transformed American culture. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration added the phrase, "under God," no doubt inspired by spiritual mobilization, to the Pledge of Allegiance. In 1955, they added, "In God We Trust," to paper money. And in 1956, they made that the United States' official motto. The American consciousness surrounding Christianity and libertarianism, atheism, and communism remained the same for a long time after. We saw this especially in the Reagan administration. Reagan was super Christian. He was anti-labor union. He railed against so-called welfare queens and was obviously anti-communist.
All these basic rights are fundamentally challenged by a powerful adversary which does not wish these values to survive.
Super rich people of the 80s and today love him for this.
The Reagan coalition was somehow the free market libertarians, the defense hawks, and the social conservatives. And so if you ask, what does the millionaire and the general and the priest, what do they actually have in common? They're anti-communist. And they have a common enemy.
In the 90s, though, things started to change. The Soviet Union fell. Communism still existed around the world, but it didn't have a global superpower anymore. And it became harder to make the case that communism was any threat to Americans. Also, for many complex reasons I won't get into here, religiosity in the US starts to decline. The next decade, atheism suddenly begins to surge. There's no concurrent surge in avowed communism in the US, but atheists show themselves to be more politically active and left-leaning than any other religious identity group in the country. Importantly, this rapidly growing group largely believes in climate change and supports climate reform policies. So, if you're an oil billionaire in the 20-teens, how do you protect your interests through media? You find someone who will adapt the corporate capitalist Christianity playbook to today's religious and media landscape. In 2013, fracking billionaire Ferris Wilks gives $6.5 million to PragerU, the infamous right-wing new media company.
Imagine for a moment a world in which there was no murder or theft. This would drive me mad. I like murder.
I like to kill people
for fun. Here is a fact. Dennis Prager should frighten you.
Then, in 2015, Ferris provides close to $5 million in seed money to co-found The Daily Wire, which he still co-owns to this day. I don't know if I even need to say this, but I will just in case. These media companies become an unbelievably prolific source, a fire hose of misinformation about climate change.
The deaths that are prevented by climate change may, in fact, be exceeded by the lives saved by climate change. Why? Because far, far fewer people die from heat exposure every year than die from cold.
They also advocate for libertarian economics.
Libertarian economics says the government should not control the free flow of goods and services. That's all libertarian economics says.
You know, the kind that primarily benefits the billionaire co-founder and co-owner of the company.
I think it's really damaging to the future of American prosperity.
And they do a ton of atheist bashing.
The replacement of God in the human heart with gods of other sorts, from the state to the search for subjective authenticity, ends in the worst predations imaginable.
For a long time, these right-wing new media guys would just regurgitate the same old talking point on atheism. Communist, atheist regimes murdered and starved millions of people, and the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. This is what atheism inevitably leads to. So atheism, even in America, is a threat. This argument worked on plenty of people in the 2010s, just as it had for decades before. But as far as I can tell, it didn't worsen public perception of atheism, communism, or left-leaning ideas. It just helped maintain existing levels of stigma. In fact, during this time, more Americans became atheists, and the public perception of atheism got a little bit better. Eventually, though, these guys strike gold with a new framing of the issue.
So the left had to come up with another way to ram their cultural Marxism through.
The woke threat to society and democracy.
They're ideologues. They are suffering from an incurable brain disease called wokeness. Reality means nothing to them.
Woke is, in fact, Marxism that's evolved to attack the West.
If you're a radical postmodern neo-Marxist.
Neo-Marxist Ken Dole himself, Justin Trudeau.
These woke neo-Marxists who are taking over society.
Woke is clearly a cult. It's a mind virus.
So I vowed to destroy the woke mind virus.
Cultural or neo-Marxism, social justice warriors, race baiters, and Bernie Sanders.
Now, with famously vague notions of postmodernism and wokeism and their supposed equivalence with Marxism, right-wing pundits can point to nearly anything and describe it as a part of the evils of communism and or the ultimate outcome of atheism. Climate reform advocacy? Wokeism set out to destroy Western civilization, just like the communists did. Support for LGBT rights? No, postmodernist secular religious dogma, just like that of the Soviet Union, intent on eliminating the notion of objective truth. Anti-racism? That's radical Marxist critical theory meant to destroy white Christian identity and replace it with state-controlled racial hierarchy, just like the communists always wanted. This reframing provides a lot of utility to the right. It still connects to long-established fears of social programs, communism, and atheism, instilled in large part by corporate America through trusted authorities in our culture. However, it also allows the right to identify their opposition with a fresh and, to some, I suppose, intellectual-sounding vocabulary instead of repeating old arguments verbatim. This better drives attention to right-wing media and ultimately benefits the massive corporations and individual billionaires that fund it. Now, on to Elon Musk. While he maintains that he doesn't believe in God, he likes to very publicly use anti-communist rhetoric to further his political and financial goals. He's a huge fan of the rhetoric surrounding so-called postmodernism, neo-Marxism, and wokeism, and has, through his ownership of Twitter, or X, helped propagate it more than probably anyone else. And most importantly, he's the richest man in the world. He is corporate America, and so he promotes anti-labor policies and attitudes. As we've discussed in this video, anti-atheist attitudes in the US are largely manufactured in order to influence regular, working people to advocate against their own interests and for the interests of the extremely wealthy. Any ideas, including Christian ones, which work against the rich and for working people, have been the real target of religious right polemics for at least a century. Anti-atheism has just served as a means to the end of demonizing those ideas. There is simply no reason for the wealthy to target Musk for his atheism when he utilizes their rhetoric to so viciously advocate for what they want. more power in their hands, more money in their pockets, and fewer services or protections for everyone else. Now, I've heard some people say things like, look, the right is so much more tolerant and united than the left. We got an open atheist and office in the White House before the left did. We're the big tent now. To that, I'd say, yeah, the right in this country has a pretty singular goal, and they're willing to tolerate differences as long as there's compliance with efforts toward that goal. The goal is more money and power for the wealthy and the powerful. If you're an atheist or a Christian, if you serve that goal, you're in. If you're rich or you're poor, if you serve that goal, you're in. Whether you're for or against the other things the right say they care about, like lower taxes for all, traditional family values, self-reliance, meritocracy, free speech, if you serve that goal, you're in. Even if you loudly proclaim that you want better conditions for working people, not just rich people, but you still ultimately serve that goal, you're in. It's no shock that Christian America is cool with an atheist corporate giant basically being president, when corporate giants decided the shape of Christian America in the first place in order to serve that goal. The left, on the other hand, we are more fragmented because control of our ideologies and even religious beliefs has been less centralized. Corporate interests absolutely shapes much of the Democratic Party, but plenty of people on the left, and even a few in the Democratic Party, do protest that. Our ideas, actions, and goals come from diverse places, and that naturally leads to more fragmentation. I do wonder, though, if we on the left can find some unity in coming together against a common enemy. Elon Musk and the disgusting greed of big corporations and billionaires which he represents. We've had some success before in the movement behind the New Deal. Let's do it again and aim to cripple the ultra-wealthy for even longer this time. Okay, my main source for the 20th century history section of this video is a book called One Nation Under God: How Corporate America Invented Christian America. That's by Kevin M. Cruz. There's so much more on the subject that I couldn't cram into one video, so I highly, highly recommend you read this book. With that, thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to support my work, subscribe and check out the religious studies courses I produce with Dr. Joseph Laycock. They are attached to the video below. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.